I'm Layla Saad, and my life is driven by one burning question. How can I become a good ancestor? How can I create a legacy of healing and liberation for those who are here in this lifetime and those who will come after I'm gone? In my pursuit to answer this question, I'm interviewing changemakers and culture shapers who are also exploring that question for themselves in the way that they live and lead their life. It's my intention that these conversations will help you find your own answers to that question too. Welcome to Good Ancestor Podcast. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Good Ancestor Podcast. Today I'm speaking with the wonderful Jasmin Kaur. She is an incredible writer, illustrator, a spoken word artist living on unceded Stolo territory. Her writing, which explores feminism, social justice, survival, and love, acts as a means of healing and reclaiming identity. As a poet and a teacher, she's toured across North America, the UK, and Australia to captivate audiences through her poetic storytelling. Welcome to the show, Jasmin, and also congratulations on your very first book. Can you hold it up for us, your debut book?
It's real. It's a real book.
Yes. And the title is When You Ask Me Where I'm Going. And I'm very excited to be talking with Jasmin today about her work, her book, which I've had the pleasure of reading. It's incredible. And she's an incredible person. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. I've, back when you mentioned this podcast to me and being on the podcast, I was just like super honored and grateful that you wanted to have me on, and just excited to have this conversation because it's so deeply rewarding for me to be able to engage in conversations about my work with women of color, to be able to dive into those, very real issues that I try to dig into through this book.
And you do so. Thank you for saying that, because, your work for me, it speaks to so many complex and nuanced issues. It was such an honor for me to get to read your work in advance of it coming out. And almost every page that I read just like hit me, straight in the heart. So I'm excited to be sharing that with everyone here today. So let's dive in. Our very first question: who are some of the ancestors, living or transition, societal or familial, who've influenced you on your journey?
So when you asked me this question originally, the first names that were coming to mind were the ancestors themselves who I mentioned in When You Asked Me Where I'm Going. So I wanted to actually read a couple of the poems that reference these individuals, and then I can share a little bit about who they were and how, their lives and their lived experiences shaped everything that I do. So the first poem is on page 83. Oh, no, it's 153. So I'll read out the poem first and then explain a little bit about it.
Please.
The English professor quotes another dead white man. Asks us whether it is better to have loved and lost than to have never loved before. The shaheeds stand before me, hearts and bodies still intact, hands tied behind their backs with the crowns once tied around their heads. One by one, they are washed away by the river. Red blooms where life once was, and love blooms where the earth loses her beloveds. So this poem is dedicated to Shaheed Jaswant Singh Kalra, and to every Singh and Kaur, to every Sikh woman and man whose extrajudicial murder was uncovered by his work. So within a Sikh context, the term Shaheed means someone who gives up their life, standing up for others, standing up for their community, standing up for those who are in danger. So this poem, I think people kind of have a lot of questions about it because of the terminology, but it essentially explores the story of Shaheed Jaswant Singh Kalra, who was murdered in 1992 by Punjab police because of his work to uncover state-sponsored murders in Punjab. So this is at a time when many Sikhs in Punjab, especially, people coming from marginalized communities, were protesting against state injustice, state caused poverty. There were farming issues that were causing, farmers to feel entirely hopeless and not feel like they had any sort of control over their lives. So this is at a time of political unrest, where young people and old people are rising up and challenging the state. And amid this time, in order to kind of curb political dissent, the police were attacking and, in many cases, torturing and murdering young protesters. So amid this time, there were parents who were coming about and saying, we can't find our kids. We don't know where our sons have gone. And just one thing, Cara, he, hearing these stories, wanted to kind of uncover the truth of what was happening. So his research led him to find, a logbook of cremations that were never informed, that where the families were never informed of the cremations, where the cremations occurred. And it was all of the names of the people who were missing, whose parents had come to him, asking about, finding their sons and daughters. So he found those logbooks, and he found records of those state-sponsored cremations and deaths. And he took his research across the world. He came to Canada, England, the US, trying to shed light on these atrocities. But when he went back home to Punjab, one day he was picked up by the police and he was never heard from again. And it only came out later, when the police finally admitted that they had detained him and that he was tortured and murdered by police because of his activism. And I think it was about 10 years later that the police who murdered him were tried and convicted in his death. So Jaswant Singh, Shahid Jaswant Singh's name is a household name among Sikh families across the world. So when I wrote this poem, I was thinking about what love means through an anti-colonial lens. I was thinking about how, we describe, love in this one term within a Western context, which is between you and your partner, or romantic love. But what does it mean to love your community so much that you will go to the ends of the earth to find the truth for them, and to even, give up your life in the process. Right. So I think that a lot of my work is inspired by, this beautiful history of revolution and activism that comes from my Sikh community, and the values that have been instilled in me through, living through a Sikh lens. And I think that that's something that was important for me to channel through this work as well. I think that it can be kind of frightening to finally have a space to tell your story, and then feel well, people will be receptive to it if I truth as it is, whole and entire. There can be this kind of voice in the back of your mind that says, maybe I should water this down, maybe I should make it more palatable to white people, or to white spaces. But I think the beauty of this book is that I did not do that.
And that's what I wanted to say. That's one of the things that was that I love so much about the book, is that you didn't, it felt as I was reading through it that you were writing for yourself, rather than writing to have to explain, look, this is what my culture is and this is how it works. You didn't spend that time having to sort of do that educational work, which I really appreciated, because for so many of us especially those of us who are people of color, but we are not living in the cultures from which our parents are from, we get conditioned to always having to explain things, thinking, oh, what I do is an exception to what's normal, so I'm going to have to explain it to you. I really love that you didn't do that. It made your work, for me, it was no, this stands on its own. It's not less than or other just because it doesn't fit within the white gaze. It is what it is. And it reminded me of how growing up, when we were growing up in the UK, my parents tried to give us names that were Muslim Arabic names or Muslim names, but that were easy for the white mouth to be able to
Mm,
pronounce. And what I felt when I read your book was she's not doing that.
yeah,
Jasmine is not going to do that.
yeah, I feel that,
Yeah,
and I can absolutely relate to that. I think that um, you know, it's very rare, even right now when things are so, trying to change, that I even see myself represented in, the
right.
books that I read or the media that I consume. I don't think I've ever seen a Sikh woman who ties a bistad, a turban, in any of the, mainstream media that I consume. So when I got this book deal, my first thought was, how do I continue to carve space for us? Like, I can create a book that will um be like very like universal, but like, will that do the work of pushing doors open for other Sikh women, for other Kaurs,
Right.
um who deserve to see themselves in the media that they consume? um I never grew up seeing myself in any of the books that I read. There was not a single instance growing up when I ever saw a girl who looks like me or sounds like me or has experiences like mine as a Punjabi Sikh girl,
Yeah.
in any of what I consumed. But it was interesting that I never even considered that odd, because I had never seen myself, I didn't know that I could be seen.
Right.
And I think, looking back at that as an adult now, I think that's terrible.
Right.
I think that there is a generation of girls that deserve to see themselves in the books that they read exactly as they are.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that is the absolute most important thing to me when I think about what this book will mean when it's on bookshelves.
Yeah. So I'm getting chills right now. And because, what I'm hearing you saying underneath everything else is like, you understand that you being given the opportunity to share your work in this public way, that you're not just standing there for yourself, you're bringing everyone else with you. And so that sense of responsibility is a privilege, and it's also sometimes a weight, right?
Yeah.
um, you've talked about how, with your poems, you really like crafted, recrafted, went back and back again and again, and that your creative process is quite arduous. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your creative process is, and as you're going through really trying to, because the passages are short, but each line is so intentional. um it's so like, I remember reading each part and then having to pause at the end of each one and just really let it sink in at multiple layers. It takes a lot of skill, yes, to be able to do that, but there's something else going on. There's the energy that you're pouring into it and the intention that you're pouring into it. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think when I first got into poetry, it was like right at the end of high school, like right when I was getting into university, and I was reading a lot of spiritual poetry. I read a lot of Rumi, and what I loved about Rumi's poetry was that um, the words might have been spare, but they punched you in the gut,
Right.
exactly as they were. And I remember just like being profoundly impacted by those words, and being like, this is what poetry means to me. It's being able to reach into someone's heart,
Yeah.
and get down to the heart of what a message is. Cut away all of the excess, and just get to the root of a thought. Um, and of course, that's like evolved for me over the years, that concept of what poetry means to me. But I think that has been a huge influencer in how I started writing. So with my poems, in this book, it was very important for me to write some pieces that are one stanza long, and to write some pieces that are, five stanzas long,
Right.
because as a teacher, I know that learning takes place in a variety of ways, and and learning is better for everyone when there are diverse mediums through which we are able to express ourselves.
Right.
Um, so sometimes those like one stanza poems are very, very important, and sometimes I need to flesh them out in different ways as well. So when I write poetry, it's a little different than when I write prose. I tend to start with a mind spill, as I like to call it. Like, I just like to throw all my words out on paper as if no one is ever going to look at it, because I feel like when I have that editorial mindset already kind of ingrained in me, then it kind of stunts me. Like I can't get down to my thoughts. I can't write because I'm so worried about what everyone will think. So I have to just write as if no one is going to look at it. And that's how I kind of take whatever's happening in my brain and put it down on paper. And after that is when I can read back my words and find that which is meant to be kept for myself and find that which is meant to be shared with my audience, because I think that there's definitely a difference. I think that there are certain
Can you
thoughts.
talk about that? Yeah, talk about that.
So I remember in one of my poetry classes in university learning that communication is not just what you intend, but what is conveyed. So I think that there are some thoughts that I write that will only ever make sense to me. And then there are some ways of expressing things that are meant to be conveyed to others. And I can't remember which poet it was who said this, but there was a poet who I really, really admire, and I can't believe I'm forgetting her name now, but she mentioned that she has one journal just for herself and one that is meant to be like shared with the world. So I feel like there is some writing that is just meant for you. I feel like, we live in a day and age now when we are made to believe that everything needs to be shared with the world in order for us to be relevant. And sometimes that means that we lose time for ourselves and that sense of, self-development and self-care that has to happen in private. So going back to like my editing process, I go through that, large mind spill and reflect on what needs to be shared and what needs to be kept for myself. And that's when I take those thoughts and think about how I can refine them. I think about how I can shape these words in the best possible, most succinct possible way to get to the heart of what I mean and to cut away the excess. And then from there, I tend to pass my work on to a couple of trusted people. I like to know how my message is being communicated, as I said. And if the communication process isn't working, then I have to go back to the drawing board and start again, or change up my language, or listen to that feedback. And then it's just a process after that of amalgamating the feedback I receive with my original intention. Because I feel like feedback is very, very valuable, but you also have to have a sense of trust with your own like intention of what a work means. So it's about kind of bringing those two together and then creating something that is ready for the world.
I love that. Thank you for that piece around, sharing it with a small number of trusted people who will I'm assuming who will be able to hear the place that you're coming from and really want to hold that energy, and also like want to pull out the best of you as well, and are able to give you feedback in a way that is constructive and compassionate at the same time. I think many of us find it difficult to do that, because what I'm hearing, like, even as you're speaking about your creative process and what you said about, so many of us think that if we don't share what we have put together, that it's not relevant, right? And so we are so used to like create, share. And what you're talking about is slowing the whole thing down, actually, and really taking care with every single part of it, so that when you do put it out into the world, it's how you really want it to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that, like I said, like the day and age that we're living in, where everything happens on social media, it affects like our creative process, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a negative way. I think that capitalism's violence seeps into everything all the time.
Right.
And I think especially difficult when you are an artist trying to kind of stay afloat and to, come onto social media to have your voice heard, especially when it's becoming more and more difficult to be heard on social media. So, for example, I came on Instagram like years and years ago because I love the idea that I could just, share my complete thoughts and not have to wait for someone else to decide that my thoughts are valuable enough to be heard. I can just go onto my Instagram and share it, and whoever resonates with it will resonate with it, and they can find my work easily and on their own. So that's why I came to social media. But like now I feel like, because we're living in a time where everything is being commodified, everything is being kind of capitalized upon, it's even difficult for artists, and especially like emerging artists and young artists and artists that are just trying to break into these industries to be able to be heard on social media, where you're now expected to pay money just to be heard by the people who already have established that they resonate with you because they
Right.
follow your work.
Right.
So I can definitely understand why this kind of like pressure has been created, because like social media places that pressure on us. But I
Right.
think that it's so important and so valuable for us to step back and just like take a look at what this monster is and realize that our work
Right.
is more important than this need to create and share quickly.
Right. It's this double-edged sword, right? Because it's like social media is the way through which people who don't know you would get to know you because your work gets shared. And at the same time, if we're not intentional again about about our own creative process, it just hijacks the whole thing.
Yeah.
And then you're being run ragged and you're outputting a lot, but it's more quantity than quality.
Exactly.
Yeah. And like I said, I could feel with each passage of your book, like the quality and the care that was put into it, at multiple different layers. There's a if I'm going to switch gears a little bit,
Sure.
I'd like to open your book and sort of look at some of the poems that really jumped out at me. The
Sure.
first one, and I'll tell you which page it's on, and then you can find it in yours. Because I'm not going to recite it. You're going to recite it. You recite so beautifully. An open letter to South Asians.
Okay.
Mm.
Let's see if I can find that one.
That one really hit me in the gut. Like,
Yep.
yeah.
I think that was a necessary one.
Yeah.
For a lot of different reasons. I've got it here, page 9. So I'm going to recite this one. An open letter to South Asians. But what if you get dark? Is to say that dark bodies don't let light in. Is to say that there is something dirty about the biological makeup of skin. Is to say that some people are born clean and need to keep it that way. Is to say that you don't hate Black people, but you thank God you weren't born one. So this is like a very, very heavy poem, and it's inspired.
Yeah.
It's inspired by a lot of the things that I've seen close up and firsthand in my community, and I think that it's a difficult conversation to have, but one that is so very necessary. I think that colorism is so steeped in so many different communities of color, and especially in South Asian communities, and that's why this letter is directed very specifically and pointedly at South Asians, because I see this happening all the time in my own community, where people who are light-skinned are praised as beautiful, and people who have darker complexions are seen as the opposite. And I've always wondered like where that arises from, because historically in South Asian traditions and Punjabi traditions, there are beautiful descriptions of dark-skinned people, and it even comes in like Sikh scriptures, describing one's lover as like dark skin. But now we live in a day and age, through colonial violence, through the trauma that was British occupation of South Asia, where light skin is viewed as the norm of beauty and darker skin tones need to be corrected, enlightened through like Fair and Lovely and all these kind of products that are deeply harmful, physically and like psychologically. So this poem kind of comes from that. I think back to a moment that I've heard retold to me, about when I was born. So also in South Asian cultures, like there's like this kind of bias, that male children are just better. It's better to have a boy than a girl simply because they will be able to continue like the family name and like pass on like generational wealth and all this kind of stuff. So the birth of girl children, is often in certain generations of our community seen as like a bad thing, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. And that's a whole story to get into in and of itself. But I remember someone telling me that when I was born, someone who saw me said, "Oh, well, you had a daughter, but at least her skin is fair." Like as if that was like a redeeming quality,
Right.
in my birth as like a girl. And I think that moment is like, it's constantly resident in my mind, and it's indicative of how much work our community needs to do, to unpack these biases and these absolutely dangerous ideologies that light skin is inherently beautiful.
Right. Right. Yeah, and it's so important for people to understand that anti-blackness is global. It's not just something that white people hold, it's something that non-black people of color hold, and it's something that black people hold as well and have to work through. The lightening creams and the, all of that industry is so huge, and it just preys on, as you said, this idea that lighter is, whiter is more pure.
Yep.
And I hear that so often. What if you get dark, right? So even here in the Middle East, there are certain cultures who, when they go outside, will make sure that they're carrying an umbrella, make sure that their, hands and their feet are covered. And I look at it and I'm like, wow, like what if you get dark? What will actually happen? And I know so much of it is tied to colonialism, but it's also about, I think in many cultures about, if you're darker skinned, you're seen as someone who works outside and therefore
Mm.
are of the lower
Yep.
class. And it hurts my heart a lot.
Absolutely.
It's something that I think specifically in non-Black people of color communities is a conversation that really is very important, because you have to hold that duality of, yes, we have been absolutely oppressed and affected by the violence of colonialism and white supremacy, and at the same time our anti-blackness harms Black people and people who are dark skinned, both and at the same time, right?
Absolutely. And I think that this is work that we have to do, as South Asians, as Punjabis. It's work that has to happen internally within our community, and we have to be willing to have those difficult conversations or those uncomfortable conversations, and move past that sense of, that sense of ego sometimes that can be stopping people from being able to humble themselves enough to have the conversations about their own biases. Because I feel like as people of color, we tend to feel that our conversations about our oppression needs to come first. And I've seen that firsthand, where people will say, oh, that's a conversation for later, because we are dealing with this systemic violence and this and this and this, and we are experiencing xenophobia and racism. So we need to have those conversations first, and conversations about the harm that we are causing, that can come after. And I think that in itself is so problematic, because we don't get free in isolation. We get free as a collective,
Together, right?
Together, and there is no freedom unless all of us are working towards it,
Right.
in tandem.
Yeah.
So I think that's where a lot of the work needs to start, even within radical activist spaces, within like our communities.
Yeah. Yeah. Jasmine, tell me a little bit about, what influenced you on this path to sort of really digging into how colonialism and systems of oppression have had this impact in the world, and what were the kind of like turning moments for you that made you really, want to dig into this work?
That's a great question. So I feel like part of it really comes from the Sikh tradition of like resistance. So Sikh spirituality is deeply embedded into Sikh politics as well. We are taught the concept of midi and fidi, which means that you are embedded in spirituality, but you are also completely aware of what's happening around you in the world, and you are resisting injustice. So this is embedded into our spiritual practice, not just like our political practice,
Right.
our political praxis. So I think as Sikh youth, we often grow up hearing stories of Sikh activists, like I mentioned, like just once
Yeah.
in college, we grow up, being told these stories at bedtime. So it for many of us becomes like a part of who we are from a very young age. And I think that's really, really beautiful.
I do
My
too. Yeah.
this thought, for example, my
Yeah.
Sikh turban, it has a political history as well, which I want to touch on.
Please do. Yeah.
So during the time period of the sixth Sikh Guru Har Gobind Sahib, um, turbans were, only tied by the ruling class. They were tied by royal people, they were tied by politicians and political leaders. And there was a decree passed that only those in positions of power are allowed to tie turbans. So as an act of resistance, the Sikh Guru had all of, their Sikhs begin to tie turbans as a means of saying that all human beings are equal. So it's like, even when I step out into the world, my physical identity is deeply embedded into my activism and my politics. So for me, there is no separation between like all these different worlds. Existence to me is political, and it's an act of resistance to exist in this body as it is, as a Sikh. So when I got into university, that's not necessarily when like my awareness of like political issues became like became established. I think that this was something that was in me from childhood.
Mm-hmm.
I gained inspiration from these stories, but in university, it's when I started realizing that I don't just need to wait for someone older to kind of give me directions on how to make a difference in the world. Actually, I can do these things as well. So that's kind of when I became empowered to research on my own further and engage my community and youth around me in these kinds of conversations. So in my first or second year of university, I organized one of my first arts events, which centered around poetry, but it also centered around issues related to the incarceration of Sikh activists in Punjab. So it was a way of kind of bringing together these two things that I'm passionate about, poetry and activism.
Yeah.
So interestingly, like my poetic journey began and grew through like my journey in activist spaces as well. So I think that's where a lot of these poems come from. It's in that understanding that poetry is meant to be used as a medium for activism. Going back to the sixth Sikh Guru, there's like historical records that describe the ways in which, during that time period in South Asia, there was deep-rooted political oppression. The ruling classes were extremely violent towards like religious minorities, and there's a lot of persecution that took place. And the Guru, although encouraging Sikhs to take up practices of self-defense, also encouraged poetry as a means of resistance, and as a means of inspiring people to feel engaged in their community. So like, again, going back to my Sikh tradition, this is like rooted in me from way before birth through my ancestors, to use poetry as a means of raising my voice and being heard and amplifying others as well.
Thank you for sharing that rich history, and I can understand how it's a difference between there's a difference between sort of learning about it as an intellectual subject as a sort of young adult versus growing up in
Absolutely.
a culture that has that at its very core. It informs everything that you do and everything that you are. And so this work is just a natural extension of, everything that's been poured into you, through your ancestors, up to your family now, and that you are continuing to walk the path of your ancestors and your community, which is so beautiful. In doing this kind of work, which is, as you said, there's this rich history of resistance at the Sikh core, is how do you handle sort of when you're somebody who is leading resistance work, or you are doing resistance work, you're going to get resistance pushing back at you, right?
Absolutely.
What has that been like for you, for people who find your messages and your work uncomfortable, find it that there's reactions of fragility or actions of threat of harm, if that occurs? How do you walk that?
That's a really important question. I think that there are definitely people who want to understand me in parts. And that goes for my Punjabi Sikh community. It goes for, white people who follow me. It goes for like everyone. I think that, for example, there are a lot of white women who will really, really love, my love poems and
Right.
My less overtly political poems, because I feel
Right.
like everything I do is political in some way, but it just needs to
Right.
be unpacked. But they'll say, I love these kinds of poems, but like this one, like I really, like I could have done without it. And conversely, I'll see people who say, I love your political poetry that is like, very specifically linked to like revolution, but I don't like how you were talking about, you know, um, dressing in a way that is empowering to you, which doesn't adhere to what I traditionally view as like modesty, for example.
Right.
So I feel like from many different angles, I'm being told, I like this part of you, but not that part of you. And you should quiet down that part and amplify this part. And for me, I understand that all of this encompasses myself. None of it can be taken. I cannot be sliced into pieces, which also references one of my poems in the book as well, where I kind of expand on that. But I don't want to be understood in pieces. I want to be able to hand you the entirety of who I am and have you know that this is me from beginning to end. So going back to the book, there were very specific reasons why I chose the chapters that I chose. The first chapter, Skin, it deals with my interactions with the world at an external level, how my skin and everything on it is interpreted by a world that refuses to understand me. And the racism sometimes that I experience, the misogyny, all of that is kind of encompassed in that book or in that chapter. And then the next chapter, I dig a little bit deeper into my internal self and I get to muscle, which is the resistance, the outrage at injustice, the outrage at like the violence that I experience in the world. I'm digging into like myself in that more intimate sense. And then we go a little deeper into the lung and we deal with, sadness, pain, existential crises that occur as a result of those things that I've mentioned previously, where you are deeply misunderstood by the world. And then we enter Nerve, which is my fictional short story, which I see as kind of an amalgamation of like the themes that I discuss in my poetry come to life in the stories of these two Punjabi Sikh women, who, again, like I've never seen Punjabi Sikh women described in that way on paper before. So it was important for me to kind of bring my poems together in the form of fiction and in the form of these two women's lives. And then we move into Heart, which deals with love in every sense, whether it is love for your family, love for your partner, love for revolution, love for your community. And then we end off on Light, which is poems that deal with a sense of freedom from everything that I've described before, a sense of liberation from the oppressions and shackles that you experience in the world. And all of those chapters, as different as they are, encompass my experience. I could have just written a poem that was just written a book that was only poems like Skin, or only poems like Heart, or only poems like Lung, but all of it needed to come together because I wanted to explain that my experience in this world as a Sikh woman is multifaceted, complicated, and you can't just understand me through tropes and limited ideas of who I am. You need to understand that I am just as complicated and complex as you, even though I look different from you and you have these kind of stereotyped notions of what my life is like because you only see me on the outside. So that's kind of like where all those things kind of come together through like my writing.
I love this so much. And when you were talking earlier, before you started talking about people wanting to understand you and love you in parts, you were talking about something else, and Audre Lorde just came to me, and I was like, "It's a lot of Audre Lorde in what she's talking about." And I was like, "Oh, maybe because I just love Audre Lorde, maybe I'm just I link everything to her." But then when you said about people want to love me in parts, that's when it really struck me. She really struggled a lot with, people either wanted her to only talk about issues of Blackness, right? Or, issues of being a lesbian. There were those who were not happy because she had relationships with a white man and a white woman and had biracial children. And she just was like, I define myself for myself. And if
Absolutely.
you're going to deal with me, you're going to deal with the whole of me. Every single part is me. And I so see that when you were explaining that there are some people who the popular poems that they'll like to share, the ones that are maybe seen as universal, the love poems, the ones that don't necessarily deeply reference your culture, your history, issues of oppression. But then the rest, they're like, we don't need that, and the converse is true as well. And what I hear you saying is, to everyone's gaze, I am going to be who I am, and I am nuanced
Absolutely.
and complex and multi-layered and ever changing. And what I love about that, and why I think so many people struggle with that, is because so many of us don't give ourselves permission to be that ourselves. So when we see someone else doing it and insisting, these are all the different parts of me, all of these contradictions are perfect. They're not contradictions even, they are just the wholeness of who I am. People are like, but no, you can only be this, you can only be this one thing. And I see that as something as humanity that we really struggle with, giving ourselves permission to be whole. And so when someone
Absolutely.
comes along, it's like, it's either going to inspire you or it's going to trigger you in a way where you're going to react in a really violent way.
So something you mentioned like just a little earlier was that, or we talked about, white women engaging with my poetry. And that reminded me of an instance where, my Scream poem, which went viral, was altered and kind of made to suit, the white, or like, the immediate needs of like neoliberal America and, politics in America at the time. So I think it was last November, so it was about a year ago, when my poem, which reads, "Scream, so that one day, 100 years from now, another sister will not have to dry her tears wondering where in history she lost her voice." Where that poem was altered, where somebody crossed out the word "scream" and just wrote "vote." And I remember seeing that alteration, and just feeling like, I don't like this, but I don't know if I'm allowed to say something about this. This makes me uncomfortable, and I'm not really sure why exactly yet, but I want to know if I can say something about it without being seen as that loud, woman of color who's just making a big deal about something that's really not a big deal.
Right.
So I kind of went back and forth reflecting on my discomfort and like my sense of frustration for a couple days before I even found the courage to say anything about it. So when I first wrote this poem, it had to do very specifically with my relationship with my identity as a Sikh woman. I was thinking about how so much of Sikh history is told and recorded by Sikh men. There are Sikh women who documented their lives, but they are very far and few in our history. And I was reflecting on how my understanding of myself as a Sikh woman today would be different if I had more writing by historical Sikh women to look back upon, to be able to see myself within. And then I came back to the present moment where, I'm living in a day and age now where I'm able to document my whole life. I'm able to go onto Instagram or social media or Twitter and write about myself and share images of myself and render myself visible in a world that so often doesn't want to see me. And just reflecting on how amazing that is, that myself and so many, young Sikh women are doing the exact same thing today, whether, they are passionate about photography or fashion or cooking or whatever it is that we are able to render ourselves visible in this world. And just thinking about the impact that could have, 100 years from now, when another God, another Sikh girl or woman can look back and reference us as, kind of perspective points on, like, what life was like 100 years ago for women just like her, and how beautiful and empowering that would be for someone 100 years from now to be able to collect those kinds of stories. So when I wrote this poem, it was very specifically to do with, the documentation of our lives as Punjabi Sikh women. And then I was very, very surprised to see that it resonated with others, because I thought that it was one of those thoughts that just made sense inside of my own mind and wouldn't make anyone else. But so when people resonated with it, I was so surprised, and it was very positive for me. But I was also like very interested that women of very different communities were resonating with it for reasons that were entirely different than what I had intended. And I thought that in itself was beautiful, that we're able to find so much within one metaphor.
Right.
the issue
Which
occurred.
is the beauty of poetry, right? Yes,
Absolutely.
right.
I think the beauty of poetry is all those multiple layers and meanings.
Yes,
But the issue is when someone wants to assign a single meaning to my work
right,
and diminish all the other meanings. So
right.
when the word scream was crossed out and replaced with the word vote,
Yeah,
what it was saying was that my one single interpretation of your work is the only one that matters. This poem cannot mean anything else. It has to mean what I think it means. And
right,
I'm going to do this without asking for your permission because I think that I'm entitled to do that.
right.
And when I actually sat and reflected on, like, that being the reason why I'm so upset about this, I was like, I have to speak about it.
Mm.
Because if I don't, um then my voice is being erased out of a conversation about my voice.
Right,
um,
exactly. The irony of it, right?
exactly. I think
Yeah,
that was so ironic to me that, this was a poem about, my voice is Sikh woman, and now my voice is being removed from it to suit someone
right,
else's need. So
right.
when I spoke out about it, I did so very, very nervously. I think because of exactly what I said, that we are socialized as women of color to want to be as palatable and polite as possible.
And to
And
seem as unthreatening as possible.
exactly.
Right,
So when I spoke my mind, I think there were definitely like some people that were like, oh, this is a big deal for no reason, or oh, I don't see why you had to write a whole post about it, or you can't you
right.
get over it, like,
Or
yeah.
or take it as a compliment of your work or
Yeah,
something
I got that
that,
one as well.
yeah,
It was like, no, like, it's not a compliment for someone to take my work, change it without permission, and
right,
expect me to be okay with it. That's not a compliment. A
right,
compliment would be you doing the work to understand who I am and why I wrote
right,
this. Have a conversation with me about it
right,
first, at least.
right.
Um, so I was very, very happy that there were people who listened to what I had to say
Mm,
and valued my perspective on this alteration and did the work of, removing the post that they had posted mistakenly where my words were edited and then crediting me for my work. So
right.
that was deeply, like, um, that was deeply positive for me, but I was also very aware of the fact that I had upset a lot of people by speaking my mind. And the thing was, if me being honest about how I feel about alteration of my work upsets you to that point that you need to unfollow me, then you should be unfollowing me, because the space is not meant for you in that case. If you are here to learn, if you are here to challenge yourself and grow, you are absolutely welcome. But if you need to shape me into who you want me to be in order to stay, then I don't think that you should be here in the first place.
Yes, amen. Amen for that. Because, again, I'm just so struck by how we are often walking this very tricky line between being people who are seen as public figures, who are putting work out into the world that is consumed in this sort of mass way. And that's great because more people are getting to see our work, and it means that our work gets to grow. And at the same time, like, you spoke of the erasure, right? And
Yeah.
I think a part of this is also to do with, aside from the obvious side of like privilege and power, right? There is also the way that social media functions, where it's like I can just take this and do what I want with it and just
Yeah.
spit it back out into the world. But what I'm hearing you say, and what I really respect about you, is that you were clear that your boundaries had been crossed,
Yeah.
right? And yes, I'm here as a public figure. I put my work out into the world. I do share it, but that does not mean that you can take my work, reinterpret it, remix it, reinvent it, and then spit it back out as if it's nothing, when I had to pull it from my the depths of my guts, right,
Yeah.
to get it. And I think that's what so many of us as artists and creative people, that we have to know, that, as you said, yes, you do have the right? Yes, I do have the right to say, this is how I want my work to be understood, or this is how I want my work to be portrayed. And if you would like to change it, you need to ask me and not assume that you can just take it. Of course, it happens to everyone, but it also happens the way that when it happens between someone who has racial privilege over someone who does not, there's just a whole other level of violence to it. because then you're in a position where you're like, am I allowed to, do I have permission? And then can I say it in a way where I can stand up for myself? But what if it causes this lashback, which it does, no matter how you say it, right? Because you just merely using your voice is going to cause that, which is, again, speaks to the irony of what the poem was about.
Absolutely.
So it's a tricky line that we're treading, but it's important for us to hold the line as well. You know, it's important for us, I think, to really hold that line.
I agree. And I think I remember when I posted my response, I also encouraged people in my audience to do the work of understanding who I am. You know, if you're going to consume my work
right.
so freely on the internet, wherever, you know, I post my work, I think that the very least that somebody can do is to put the effort into understand who I am and why I am. So, for example, I often have people posting questions on my social media like, oh, your last name is God. Does that mean that you are, you know, you're related to this other person with the last name God that I know? Or, you know, things of that kind of like nature. And I think that it's a well-intentioned enough question, but it also implies to me that people have not gone out of their way to do the work to understand who I am and why I have this name. So for context, during the period of the 10th Sikh Guru, when the Sikh identity was being solidified in a very visible way, the Guru had all of their Sikhs take on names that erased the caste-based kind of connotations of traditional South Asian last names. So all Sikh men took on the name Singh, which means lion, and all Sikh women took on the name God, which means, you know, royal or prince. And what was implied through taking on those names was that all human beings are equal and we will not be bound by, you know, the classism inherent in these names that have been given to us. So all Sikh women, like I said, take on this name, and it's a beautiful sense of like sisterhood that's created when you can see yourself represented in everyone of your faith. So when Rupi Kaur's book came out, for example, I think it was a huge moment for a lot of Sikh women to just see their name, God, on this book that's being sold in like a public space. But I think that there's still so much misinformation about like what the name God means and who we are as Sikh women. So like I've had, you know, white women comment things on my posts like, are you just, you know, writing poetry because your name is God and you're trying to benefit off of another woman?
Which is
and it's like they don't even realize that it's xenophobic as they're saying it, and they don't even realize how ignorant it is.
It is extremely ignorant,
to suggest that you know, Sikh women's stories don't deserve to be heard, because
or there can only be one.
Exactly. And the thing is, like, like I said before, like representation of Sikh women is so limited in mainstream literature, that it was such a victory for like one of us to be heard, you know, through Milk and Honey, and that was one way of pushing the door open for so many other voices to now emerge. So I think that like our stories as Sikh women are nuanced. We are not just a monolith. We are not just one book. We are millions of books, and all of our books deserve to be out there in the world. And this name God deserves to be celebrated and heard in many different ways, and not just in a single context. So when I see, you know, white women commenting these things like, oh, you know, you're just here because of your name. I hope that thousands more women with this very same name, God, do the exact same work of being able to, you know, have their books published and have their stories heard, because all of us deserve to be heard, and not just, you know, a handful of us or a minority of us.
The ignorance of those kind of questions is just it's mind-blowing, but also not, also so predictable, and speaks to this idea that, you know, if Rupi's name was Smith and your name was Smith, you wouldn't get that kind of a question. And so it's this idea that, oh, she's got this name that's other, we don't really know it. Oh, there's another one that must mean that, you know, she's doing this because of this reason.
Yeah.
which is so limiting. And I think so many people who hold white privilege do not realize the ways, like big ways, okay, yeah, but these small ways with these throwaway comments in which they limit people of color to
Yeah.
how they think we are supposed to be, or how far they think we are supposed to go, or how big they believe we are supposed to grow, is so limiting. And so the work that so many of the guests like yourself who I get to speak to on this podcast, and just people all over the world, are doing to assert and say, despite what you may believe about me, actually I do have a right to be here, and I will
Absolutely.
be here in a way that honors who I am and what makes me comfortable, and not what makes you comfortable, which is so revolutionary. And at the same time, um, it's revolutionary and it's powerful, and it's also a daily risk, because
Absolutely.
you're exposing yourself to harm,
Yeah.
and that's just the truth of it.
I agree. And I think that it's very difficult work to kind of like carve space for ourselves. But it's so necessary. And I think that in those moments where I'm just like, why am I on social media? Like just the barrage of, constant like ridiculousness gets too much sometimes. I know that if I remain, it's going to make it easier for another God to walk through the door next,
Right.
or to be able to be herself,
Right.
or to be able to, carry herself as she chooses and not the way that other people want her to exist.
Yeah.
As I say that, I think back to the ninth grade, when I at the time did not tie a turban, I didn't tie this thought, but I did cover my head with like a ramal, which is a smaller form of like head covering,
Mm.
worn by Sikhs. And it's a lot more of a subtle head covering, so
Mm.
people aren't going to notice it as easily as my very visible turban. And I remember a Sikh girl walking by in the hallway, and I was standing next to my white friend as she walked by, and this girl had this thought tied on her head that was very, very, big and prominent. And my white friend turned to me and said, "You should never tie that. It won't look nice on you," or just that doesn't look nice. You should definitely not do that. And I just remember like the impact of like, living in this, this world where like my identity as a Sikh is being like constantly like
Right.
told to like shrink and diminish.
Right.
Um, so I feel like just being visible sometimes is a radical act.
Yeah.
And despite how difficult it can be, the reward is that it's easier for me every single day to be myself because I've carved this space for myself. And I think and I hope that it becomes easier for others as well to
Yeah.
remain themselves when they can see themselves represented in their environment. They might not
Right.
see themselves in, literature or media or like, mainstream media yet, but like to be able to see yourself on social media represented in so many different ways, I think
Right.
can give a young person the encouragement they need to remain who they are, and
Absolutely.
to not give into those sorry, to not give into those, those voices of ignorance that tell them that their identity is not beautiful, that their identity is not valuable.
Right. As you were telling me that story, I had a flashback, something that I'd completely forgotten about. When I was, I want to say 16 years old, I decided to stop wearing the hijab. I don't wear it anymore, but I decided
Right.
to start wearing it at that time. And I remember feeling so apprehensive about first day of school. And first day of the new year, we'd finished the past year, and I wasn't wearing the hijab. We were coming back to the new year. I was going to stop wearing the hijab, so I was really feeling apprehensive about it. Now, bear in mind, I was here in the Middle East. It wasn't odd to
Yeah.
see a woman in a hijab, or even kids, in our school who were wearing hijab. But it just was new, and I was nervous.
Yeah.
And I remember coming into school and going into the bathroom before registration, and I was sort of fixing my hijab, and a girl that was in my year, she was white. She was either British or South African or Australian, I can't remember. And she sort of looked at me and said something like, it doesn't look that bad on you. Something like that,
Yeah.
which felt like the most backhanded compliment ever. It was just, it just crushed me. it really just crushed me. And I fast forward to now, and one of the things that I'm really grateful for is that there are so many representations of hijabi Muslim women in the media.
Yes.
Authors, models, rappers like Mona Haider, like so many different representations. Ibtihaj Muhammad, a fencer, who show that you can be hijabi and you are beautiful and you can be wherever you want to be. And for my daughter, whether or not she chooses to wear the hijab when she is older, that's her choice to make. But it just matters to me that she sees it's not an odd thing. And it doesn't make you this stereotype or lesser than. And it's so beautiful, which is, again, it's strange that I even have to think of that her growing up here in the Middle East where many people wear the hijab. But it's what we see through the media that shows, it's normal, but you're not going to see those people in positions of leadership, or you're not going to see them in positions of what's seen as beautiful or what's seen as valuable.
And
or it's creative or what, exactly. And so it really does matter to see people who look like yourself being represented. It changes the landscape completely of what you believe is possible for you.
Absolutely. And that reminds me of, what's happening in my motherland of Punjab today, where it's seen as strange for Sikh men or women, or Sikh people in general, to tie turbans. People are told, oh, why do you look like this? You should just kind of cut your hair. You should not tie a turban because you'll fit in better with like mainstream culture if you just kind of look this way. And that's happening in my motherland, which is like the most like devastating place, where it should be the most safe place to, celebrate yourself and be yourself. But it just kind of shows like the impact that, xenophobia and like
internalized internalized oppression, that internalized self-hate. Right.
Absolutely. So it's like the work has to be done everywhere. And for us to render ourselves visible through social media or whatever platforms we have is huge. And I hope that it continues to kind of push down these notions that we need to diminish ourselves in order to survive, or in order to thrive in society.
Jasmin, can we read another passage from your book? And I'm going to ask you to choose this time a poem or a passage that for you felt the most tender.
Okay. That is a cool direction to take this in. Because I feel like a lot of the times my spoken word is
about the resistance,
deeply like fiery and intense, but I don't get to always do those tender things.
Right.
So it's like that reflection of like all parts of myself and parts of myself, and not just some. Okay. So this is an untitled poem. It's on page 218. This morning, I wake up as if something wants me. I take another breath because I've been searching for too long for a reason to breathe. Call it the universe, call it the divine, call it whatever, but I know I was created by something much larger than a human form. I know this body, a city of its own, is the eighth wonder of the world. I know that every breath I take defies too many probabilities to count. I know that I'm hardly here long enough to unravel the mess of it all. But this morning I wake up as if life herself wants me. Because maybe it's true. This is how I remember to want myself.
Oh, that's so beautiful.
Thank you. So this poem, I think it relates to kind of, those struggles to feel like you belong in this world. And although it's very tender and personal, I think it also connects back to the politics of, living in a world where you are told to diminish yourself constantly because of your identity as a woman of color.
Yeah.
And the psychological impact and the mental health impact that takes sometimes when you're just trying to find a reason why you matter. So I think that even like, our mental health as people of color, there's a politics to it.
Yeah.
Living in this world that's extremely, rooted in white supremacy,
Right.
to wake up and smile every morning, to wake up and feel like you are valuable is an act of resistance, I think.
Yeah. As you were talking, as you were reciting the poem and then just sort of explaining, I thought of an essay by Audre Lorde called "Poetry is Not a Luxury." Have you heard of it or read
I
it?
haven't.
Okay. Can I just like read a passage of it?
Yes,
Because
please.
as you were reading that poem, and as you said right before it, you said, a lot of your poetry can be quite fiery, and oftentimes when we, as people of color and Black people, are doing our work, it's always expected that it's about resistance, it's about pushback, it's about
Yeah.
this like fire and this power, and we have to give ourselves the space to be whole, soft, tender as well, right? And she spoke about how poetry is not a luxury. There we go. And it's one of my favorite pieces by her. And she speaks about how it's not a luxury in terms of like it gives us the language to be able to interrogate our experiences. But it's also, like you said, that self-care. Like what you just recited felt like a warm bath of light to me. And in a world where so many of us are struggling with mental health, with just the realities of daily life, with the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy and what that tells us about ourselves and what we have to contend with, poetry for me doesn't feel like a luxury. It feels like a necessity. I would love to know, I'm trying to pull this essay up, but I would love to know, obviously you write a lot of poetry, it's not a luxury, but for those who are not poets or are not comfortable reading poetry, who think like, poetry is going to be really hard to get through, I don't understand the language. I know for my husband, when I first started reading poems to him, he was really surprised that it was so accessible, because what we had grown up with was like European poetry, which is beautiful, but I don't understand. Like it doesn't.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Right?
Absolutely. Yes. So likewise, like I, in my undergrad, I was just studying, Shakespeare and Milton and all these, European writers. And none of the work that was propped up as valuable reflected my lived experiences. So when I discovered Rumi, when I discovered, poets of color, Sikh poets, it became like a way of me healing.
Yeah.
And to be able to use poetry as a catalyst and a means of channeling the roots of your emotion, I think is such a powerful, beautiful thing. And it's not something that I was taught that poetry can be, because I was taught that poetry must be a puzzle to be unpacked always. And it's a pastime of the intellectual or whatever.
And almost like you have to have this certain level of training or education to be able to access it.
Yeah, so I feel like as young poets of color now, we are changing that whole rhetoric, and people don't like it necessarily because it doesn't fit within what they thought was allowed to be poetry. But it doesn't matter, because that's what we're doing, and that's how we're choosing to express ourselves.
Right. I found I think this is the opening, it might be the opening line from the piece, and she says, "Poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action."
That is so beautiful.
It is so beautiful. I really encourage you to read it. It's such a beautiful piece. But it's also, to me, what it speaks to is how it's not something that we just do because it's nice, flowery words. It has intention. It drives us forward. It feeds us. It gives us language to be able to see the things that we need to be able to see. And that again, like in a world that is very, especially now in the modern world, which is very tech driven and very capitalist and a lot of consumerism, to say, take a moment, take a beat, breathe, listen to these words, come back to yourself. And not just sort of come back to yourself so you can transcend to some other place away from here, but really to be here with what is going on. That very thing that you spoke about very early in our conversation about Sikh spirituality, about understanding that you are both like, in this world, but not of this world, essentially, right? That you hold both of those at the same time. And that is the beauty that I see that poetry contributes to the world. It's for me, it's soul food, yes, but it's like, not because it just makes me feel nice and warm, but because it gives me language, as she says, to be able to say the things that I'm not able to say about the things that I feel.
That is a beautiful way to put it. I think that exactly as you said, that is how I'm going to carry my work forward. As I, begin to like share my words aloud and, go on readings this fall for my book. I think that's a beautiful reminder when we get so caught up in the logistics and the nitty gritty
right.
of like, being a poet, to be able to come back to your root, to be able to come back to your heart through your words again and again is a beautiful privilege and an honor.
That's right. That is how I see it. So often the work that poets do is so is undervalued. It's undervalued because it doesn't look like a long memoir or a long, fictional novel with all these different characters. It's, as you said, it's maybe a stanza or 5 stanzas, but the work that is put into crafting that,
yes,
is just, to me, it just blows my mind. It really, really does. And that when you're left with it, and as I keep saying to you, I read your work, and with each passage did not have the words to be able to explain how it made me feel. It was all feeling, and it was like, it was just like, that's how I felt, just, and that is so special in a time like now. I mean, it's been special always, as you said,
but it's
all
so
the way
necessary
back through
right now.
but right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that we're living in a world that is teetering more and more towards walls, towards borders, towards misunderstanding of those who are different from us. And I feel like poetry can be a beautiful bridge to be able to come back to our human selves, to come back to our hearts when this world wants to harden us and turn us into concrete.
That's so beautiful. Thank you, Jasmin, for saying that. This has been an incredible conversation. I feel so honored to be able to speak with you today. And you just brought so much. I really want people to go and buy your book. I really want them to soak themselves in it. And, the thing with poetry is that you can just return to it again and again and again. You can read it all the way through the first time, and then anytime you can just flip to any page and just soak in those words. So I really encourage everyone to read it. As we close up, I'd like to ask you our final question. What does it mean to you to be a good ancestor?
To me, being a good ancestor means that I leave enough of myself for those who come next, that they have a blueprint to either follow or to completely scrap, but there is something there for them to look back upon and say, yes, I existed in each of my past selves. Yes, I was in this world. I deserve to be in this world. I deserve to occupy the space that I occupy. And I deserve to continue pushing to create more space for myself.
That is beautiful. I love that you said they can take the blueprint or they can scrap it. There's so much freedom in that, right? Because so often we talk about, I want to lay the path before them so they can, walk where I walk. It's like, no, I just want you to know that you can, that there is a blueprint and you can also create your own.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much, Jasmin.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me, Leila.
I hope that this episode has helped you gain new insights and find deeper answers to what being a good ancestor means to you. We'd love to hear what some of your aha moments have been from this conversation. You can follow the podcast on Instagram at Good Ancestor Podcast and drop us a comment to let us know what some of your biggest takeaways have been. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being a good ancestor.